G'day everyone, my name's Andrew Todd and I'm a grain grower from the Central Wheat Belt of Western Australia and a 2020 Nuffield Scholar sponsored by GRDC, to whom I'm very grateful. I was one of 11 scholars, fortunate enough to travel on the Chile GFP during August of this year. Actually only just arrived back, so we were a bit jet lagged. We visited Chile, Argentina, USA, Spain and Italy, a bit of a whirlwind tour in 5 weeks. Off to a good start. Our group was very diverse in both gender and nationality, with members from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the Netherlands, Ireland and the first ever scholar from Japan, Cotter. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our experiences in South America, both in Chile and Argentina. Neither the Pacific Ocean or the snow-capped Andes Mountains were ever far away on our journey through Chile, a country of extremes. From the landscape to the climate, the socio-economic circumstances of the people to the agricultural production systems. We saw everything, from the largest robotic dairy in the world with 72 robots milking 5,100 cows supported by 9,000 hectares of arable land and who had plans to double in size in the coming years, right through to holistically produced beef based around regenerative farming practices on 1,500 hectares, selling direct to consumer. And then somewhere along this continuum between commodity ag and consumer focused niche was Emiliana Vineyard, producing commercial volumes of red wine from a biodynamic production system based around the lunar calendar, taking advantage of the incredible natural capacity of the region to produce quality grapes to position themselves in a highly competitive market. As diverse as the climate, agriculture includes everything from orchard crops, vineyards, beef and dairy cattle, irrigated and dryland cropping, as well as timber and salmon. Interestingly, Chile is the second largest producer and exporter of salmon globally. Like many places we heard of ever-increasing exports to China. Agricola Garces, a massive family business producing, processing and exporting fruit, being an example of this, with 90% of their 7.5 million boxes of cherries being shipped to China, a market which Chile holds 95% share. My mind went immediately to West Australian experience with barley. Chile is very much an aristocratic society. Extreme wealth is concentrated among a small number of families, and it's said that 1% of the population controls 80% of the capital. On the 4th of September, Chileans voted against the adoption of a new constitution, addressing many of the issues that arise from this inequity. Evidence of compulsory land acquisition and reallocation to the indigenous Mapuche people was obvious as we travelled south, with paddocks overgrown and no longer in production. It was said that this would only increase under the new constitution. This was a concern of Agricola da Selva, one of the largest family farm businesses in Chile, who had grown from 40 hectares in the 70s to an incredibly diverse operation spanning 5,000 hectares, producing everything from grain through to intensive horticulture crops. Not to mention the 77 wind turbines dotted across their holding. Here they revealed that investment was being scaled back due to the uncertainty of the political situation. For the Ferrero Hazelnut Company, and yes, we did sample a few of their products, a global search for the best Mediterranean growing conditions resulted in a massive investment in Chile to secure supply for their famous brands Ferrero Rocher and Nutella. Employing a build it and they will come strategy, the company purchased land for production, built nurseries and cleaning and drying infrastructure, and now have 4,200 hectares of their own production, complemented by 33,700 hectares, yes, that's correct, of outgrowers, a success story on a grand scale and a very interesting strategy. Rainfall decline and more extreme temperatures, particularly the incidence of frost, were a common theme. Agriculture is innovating and adapting, with avocados moving from the valley floors to the steep hills to avoid frost, and grape harvest shifting forward on the calendar significantly. We visited FIA, the Foundation for Agrarian Innovation, a government-funded body providing technical and financial support, leveraging 1% of the Ministry for Agriculture's annual budget, by assisting entrepreneurs looking to develop new and novel solutions to modern problems. Probably the most memorable and meaningful visit was to fellow 2020 scholar Antonio Zega's family property, where he is pursuing his dream of establishing a vineyard and producing wines, adding diversity to the existing enterprises of cherry and beef cattle. We enjoyed amazing hospitality in his home, sharing a meal with him and his family, and we saw his passion and his pride for his country, his family and his farm, a true Nuffield connection. And just as an aside, not in my notes, but Andrew mentioned earlier Chris Reichstein. Chris was a really good friend of mine also, and unfortunately he passed away last year. And I was very fortunate to meet Isadora, who's the very first scholar sponsored by Chris. So that was pretty special to tell her about, my mate. So over the Andes we went into Argentina, a country of frustration and missed opportunity with an apparent lack of political direction or a will to change for the better. A boom and bust economy. Crippling inflation rates, 60 to 90%, and an almost unbankable government are now the reality, with a population of 44 million people, 19 of which are on welfare and only 9.5 of which are paying tax. It's crazy. Seemingly immense agricultural production potential appears a missed opportunity. Rather than harness this potential, the government imposes significant export tariffs of 30% on soy and 12% on cereals, which is placing pressure on profitability in the sector and slowing investment and production. It's pretty hard to comprehend in a nation where the Argentine Foreign Ministry described agriculture as part of the economy, but also part of the country's identity. Despite this, the agriculture sector remains a domestic powerhouse, contributing 60 to 70% of GDP. Cereal and soybeans are the main ag exports, utilising 30 to 35% of the 135 million hectares of agricultural land. And internationally, this makes Argentina the largest exporter of soy meal and soybean oil, the largest biodiesel exporter, the second largest sorghum exporter, and the third in sunflower meal and corn. Rosario is a hub for grain production and processing. It is home to the Rosario Board of Trade and 21 inland ports spread along 50 to 60 kilometres of the Paraná River. Half of Argentina's cereals, oilseeds and soy production is located within 300 kilometres of port, and around 80% of the country's oilseed crushing capacity and biodiesel production capacity is also located here. We visited Molinos Agri's San Lorenzo facility, the second largest soy crushing plant on the planet. A busy facility with 200 Panamax vessels per year bound for all corners of the globe. For the Argentinian farmer, grain has become a currency. Growers are holding grain as a play against hyperinflation, and most farm businesses have offshore USD bank accounts, and many also have operations in the more stable Paraguay and Uruguay. These strategies are starving the struggling economy of capital, and the government and public are imposing measures to prevent this from happening. And we heard stories of grain bags being slashed in the darkness of night on farm. An alternative strategy employed by Los Oduar, a family operation, initially grain producers of corn, wheat and soy, but now also intensive pig producers, as a move to escape these tariffs and realise a greater value for their grain by turning it into pork. The challenging climate was once again a theme in Argentina, with water levels in the Paraná River at historic lows, resulting in cargoes being reduced by 25 to 30%, an enormous cost to the sector and of great concern. But out of adversity comes innovation, and the HB4 gene from Bioceres is an example of this, born from the need for greater resilience to heat and moisture stress. Originally derived from sunflower, but now available in both wheat and soybean, offering improved abiotic stress tolerance and glufosinate herbicide tolerance to boot. With 13 million hectares of dryland wheat produced in Australia, Bioceres has made moves to access our market, and it'll be extremely interesting to watch this space. Thank you.
Next on our tour was the United States of America. We flew overnight from Buenos Aires to Washington, DC, and met with 4 of the USDA's 17 programs, hosted by Susan Trueheart-Gary, a 2019 scholar from Delaware. So in the USA, we were absolutely dumbfounded by the sheer scale of both their import and export sectors being the world's biggest on both counts. So the biggest ag exports, soybeans, corn, tree nuts, pork and beef products to the markets such as, once again, China, Mexico, Canada, Japan and the EU. We then met with Foreign Ag Services to learn about their role in trade negotiations, breaking down external barriers to trade and establishing international rules and standards that are based on science. We then met with the Federal Crop Insurance Program, which, given as an Australian producer, we were so fascinated by this concept of federally subsidised crop insurance and what that meant for producers with varying different country types and business models. So over 85% of the US's ag production is insured under crop insurance programs. Those productions are now extending to aquaculture crops such as oysters, etc. We then met with the Natural Resource NRDC and their environmental quality incentive program. So a lot of co-investment when it came to planting cover crops and changing land use or practices, and massive investment in conservation easement programs. We then had a quick touchdown on the Farm Bill, and we were fascinated to learn that 80% of the US of the US Farm Bill funding was actually on their food stamps program, on the nutrition program, which, fun fact, was necessary to get the representation through the House of Representatives to get this bill across the board. We're now over there. They're now waiting the midterm elections before discussing in detail which way the 2023 Farm Bill review will go. Our final meeting in Washington was with Farm Credit Council, which essentially takes federally backed debt securities, sells them on Wall Street and allows the assistance of American farmers to purchase land. So over 44% of America's farms are banked with a regional Farm Credit Council loan. 86% of those loans are less than $500,000 US. So there's massive programs in place for helping young farmers, for helping farmers that have been operating in agriculture for less than 10 years. So a lot of people who are retired, stepping into farming for the first time are massive contributors of that program. We then trekked down to North Carolina and were met by 2018 scholar Archie Griffin, and he showed us around the area and his university and the connections they had there. So North Carolina has an $87 billion state ag revenue. The ag industry in North Carolina is over double every other industry. It's incredible. 60% of that production is intensive poultry, pork and egg production. Their leading profit drivers when it comes to ag crops are tobacco, so in the middle photo there, that's cured tobacco coming out of the barns, sweet potatoes, and because they're such high labour input units, they're looking at alternative crops to help utilise that labour program throughout the rest of the year. Our next section was from our third amigo, Jason, who couldn't be with us today, but he sent a little voice memo to take us through the next couple of countries. I'll put him on now.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm in Georgia, near the Armenian border. It's high plateau wheat country. The Georgian Wheat Growers Association is looking to expand production, but generally Georgians continue to rely on cheap Russian wheat. It's done so since the collapse of the Soviet Union, signs of which abound in ruined buildings and Neva harvesters from the 70s. Despite its high production past, Georgia is currently dominated by localised agriculture, small-scale dairies of a dozen cows for cheese, indigenous grapes for wine, etc. Otherwise, the economy is propped up via pipeline access for Azerbaijani oil into Europe and US aid money, particularly since the Russian military annexed 2 regions in the north of the country. Georgia is far, far less developed, but reminiscent of the traditions that underpin the localised food systems of Spain and Italy, the last leg of our GFP. Tradition in many instances outweighed ambition in Spain, and practices were underpinned by significant, sometimes mind-boggling EU subsidies. One Spanish farmer of the Baranda heritage breed of cattle in Dehesa country of Andalusia could make more money operating a hunting park, particularly given the funding available to restore overgrazed land to more natural conditions. However, he chose to maintain the heritage herd both as beef to supply his family's direct-to-consumer business and as guiding cattle among more temperamental fighting bulls used in running of the bulls events across Spain. His family also raised Iberian pigs for the Jamón market. The pigs are finished for 3 months on acorns and whatever else they glean from the Dehesa, which mainly comprise an overstory of cork and holm oaks. Needless to say, we ate a lifetime fill of jamón at daily long lunches. The need for siesta is real. In Extremadura, we met Eduardo de Souza, who supplies ethical foie gras to high-end restaurants. Foie gras is typically produced via gavage, which is force-feeding geese to blow up their livers. Eduardo simply makes his land attractive for wild geese to land and stay with a small domestic flock of attractor birds. He rarely supplements their feed but waits until the richest part of the season before hypnotising them at night with an LED torch and slaughtering the lot. The method derives from traditions used for thousands of years where migrations of people into Iberia followed the flight paths of birds. At the big end, olive and olive oil production seem to be supplanting almost all other agriculture in Spain. Spain is the world's largest olive and olive oil producer, and we looked at everything from breeding, high efficiency production to tasting. Double-digit growth is being driven by global demand. No longer just for the tougher country, olives have been planted across the more verdant flat, typically reserved for durum and wheat and barley. Newer high-intensive growing methods are shaping the industry, including the development of varieties that can handle close row planting and overhead machine harvest. One company, Todd, has bred high production, high quality varieties that offer the flavour of the most desirable lines, but in a more efficient hedged canopy. Uptake locally is confident, and they're looking to supply their cultivars into the global market. We also visited an enormous sheep dairy with one key cheese customer. Dos Hermanos was the agricultural arm of a large family business with its roots in publishing and real estate. They were milking 12,000 sheep across 3 parlours for 6 million litres a year, which translates to over 1 million kilograms of cheese, mainly for domestic consumption. The farm grew much of its own feed, had several years of silage banked and its own composting and water treatment system. It also backed onto a large area of land reserved for biodiversity. As such, they were allowed to dump carcasses to feed endangered local vultures. By the number of vultures festooning trees and wheeling above, they're far from extinction. Climate change, water availability and labour was a regular theme again in Spain. A wheat breeding lecturer and agricultural historian who took us on a quick tour of Seville called Spain the next California in terms of impending water crises. We also discussed during European visits and among the group throughout the GFP the 2030 sustainability targets that may have well-considered objectives but worrying targets without well-supported methods for implementation. A number of economic studies expect production will decrease by 20%, imports and food costs will increase, and despite objectives of self-reliance, food security will be diminished. This perhaps presents an opportunity for Australia if our own policies avoid developing without effective methods of a transition. Italy too leveraged cultural tradition and story for profit at all scales. It appeared far less reliant on EU subsidy beyond funds for infrastructure expansion. Standout visits included a high alpine sheep dairy in Abruzzi, combined with an agriturismo operation that employed 22 people and produced award-winning cheese. Bigger still was Parmesan Reggiano producer Salicito in Parma, turning out 10 33-kilo wheels of identity preserved cheese a day, with waste whey going to their own piggery. They supplied pork to prosciutto giant Galoni. We were guided around Galoni's main plant by owner Marilla Galoni, the reigning queen of Parma prosciutto, through hall after hall of curing meat and into the receival and processing areas. Their customer base is global, particularly strong in the American market and growing Japanese market. High volume, high value production is seeing expansion with another plant next year, doubling production that is currently already in the millions. In these parts, the scent of curing ham on hooks is the scent of serious money. The other scent of money further north in Torino was coffee. Trucked in bulk from the port of Genoa from collectivised small growers from all over the world, coffee has seen the family-owned Lavazza grow from bespoke origins into a global coffee powerhouse alongside Nestle and Starbucks, though they've also begun acquiring smaller roasters too to shore up the growing profit of the craft coffee sector. The other key growth area, much to their PR man's disappointment, was pod coffee. Their automation for roasting, addressing quality parameters and packing and storing coffee in various forms was a sight to behold. What human ingenuity and robotics has done for economic efficiency in processing, warehousing and distribution was staggering throughout the GFP. We also visited Herbaluna Organic Vineyard and Winery in the pick of Barola country in Piedmont. The country here is higgledy-piggledy vineyards across steep folds of land with $1 million per hectare land prices and global recognition of the region. Another family business in which tradition and continuity largely govern family member life choices. We were led through the vineyards and a wine tasting where thankfully the passion of the owners was undiminished and driving growth in exports. We also visited an on-farm abattoir processing heavy pigs into small goods and milling flour in a beautifully integrated grain cleaning, milling and bagging facility that raised in me some envy for EU subsidies. Our last night of the GFP started with the biggest football match in Italy, AC Milan versus Inter Milan. It was probably the greatest sporting spectacle I've ever seen. The passion of the crowd far more engaging than the game. It was a great way to end a spectacular trip full of passionate people loving what they do and where they're from. Thanks everyone, have a great time.
And just a final note to our families, those back home in our businesses, keeping the home fires burning, our investors and the group we travelled with, thank you.